Hello, my name is DK Lee. I am the marketing manager of Tend to Play, and today I would like to discuss the future of in-app purchases and mobile gaming through an examination of the Korean In-App Purchase Restriction Act and the Epic vs. Apple decision. If you have been to one of our previous webinars, I would like to note that this session is a bit different. Previously, we have provided webinars which are more of a informational value, but today it will be slightly more editorial. And I would like to also say that the opinions presented in this session do not necessarily reflect the views of the entirety of Sentience or Tend to Play, especially considering we're talking about law and policy and we're not a political think tank, we're a tech company. As a brief introduction as to what we will be discussing in this session, we are going to focus on putting the amendment to the Korean Telecommunications Business Act, also known as the Anti-Google Law or the Korean In-App Purchase Restriction Act, and the recent Epic vs. Apple decision into discussion. Through a thorough examination of both aspects, we hope to highlight the key aspects of the Epic vs. Apple decision, examine the weaknesses of the Korean In-App Purchase Restriction Act, and recommend ways to improve the Korean law so that it's more effective and enforceable. While the focus will mostly be on the Korean law and the legal and market conditions of Korea, we believe that the Korean In-App Purchase Restriction Act can act as a global precedent. While the world looks to regulate the ever-growing influence of big tech firms, and as such, even if we are talking about the specific situations of Korea, we believe that the conclusions and discussions that proceed today can be applied on a global scale. So, when it comes to the realm of gaming, technology, and the internet, Korea is something of an early adapter. While the rest of the world required games like League of Legends or Counter-Strike Global Offensive to start investing into esports as a legitimate field, Korea had already established a thriving esports scene based on StarCraft Brood War. While other countries still worked through a monetization model of monthly subscriptions for MMORPGs, in Korea, most companies were already working with a free-to-play with microtransaction model, which would become the norm. While streaming would become mainstream on the internet with Twitch, by the time Twitch had opened, Korea had already had an internet streaming service, Africa, for over half a decade. As such, Korea has always served as an international petri dish for testing and growing ideas and directions in which gaming and the internet would follow. Well, besides from the widespread use of ActiveX and Internet Explorer. When one of the most common activities for students to do after school is go to a PC cafe and play games with their friends, with people who grew up playing and watching games, and in history including a cable channel dedicated to esports, Korea is a country that has a large and engaged population when it comes to gaming and the internet. As such, where Korea goes, when it comes to the internet and gaming at least, the world follows. Korea establishes practices and norms which become universal in the online and technological realm. So when the Korean government added an amendment to the Telecommunications Business Act, which would be known as the Anti-Google Act, or what we'll be calling it, the Korean In-App Purchase Restriction Act, which would, in a way that banned app market operators from requiring use of their proprietary in-app purchase payment processing systems, and also denied the app market operators a claim to commissions on every in-app purchase, it caught the attention of a global audience. To give some context to the Korean In-App Purchase Restriction Act, while there had been rumbling about the proposed amendment becoming a law for a while, it was after Google announced that it would be utilizing their payment processing systems for in-app purchases, and that the 30% commission rate, which previously only applied to games, would be applied to the entirety of all applications and mandatory. This spurred further support for the bill and discussions in the Korean National Assembly, eventually making it into a law. Tim Sweeney, the CEO of Epic Games, who is and has been engaged in a legal battle with Apple and Google over the same issues, paraphrase JFK's famous speech about the Berlin Wall, in which he said, "Ich bin ein Berliner," and said on Twitter, "I am a Korean." But speaking of Tim Sweeney, recently he was part of another part of the big picture we'll be attempting to examine, the Epic versus Apple decision. For those who don't know, earlier this year, Epic executed a plan known as Project Liberty, in which they included a direct link to purchase their in-game currency, V-Bucks, on their game Fortnite, rather than go through the Google Play Store or the Apple App Store. This got them removed from both app markets, with both parties gearing up for and entering a legal battle, which concluded on September 10th, 2021. While the legal context of both aspects of this discussion, the Korean revisions of the Telecommunications Business Act, which we'll refer to as the Korean IAP Restriction Act, and the Epic versus Apple decision differ greatly as they were situated within two different legal systems of two different countries. Both have far-reaching global influence on the future of mobile gaming and come to intersect on the global stage. The goal of this piece is to place these two different perspectives on how to legislate and regulate the app market in discussion to see how they clash and affect each other. So, part one. One thing both the Korean IAP Restriction Act and the Epic versus Apple decision call to the center of attention is that of third-party payment processing systems. Both look to the control that app market operators such as Google or Apple have via requiring the use of their own payment processing systems and call for allowing third-party payment processing as a solution. However, one merely needs to read between the lines and see that the main point is not the third-party payment processing systems, but rather the commission fees that app market operators are collecting. One merely needs to look at the justifications and discussions that emerged from both sides of the discussion about commission fees and third-party payment processing systems. So, on the Korean side, Yonhap News reported that as a part of a testimony given by the Korean Internet Corporation Association, an association of Korean internet corporations led by large Korean tech firms such as Naver and Kakao, the cost of requiring a use of first-party payment processing systems would cost Korean companies $1.94 billion, with a reduction of productivity that could equal up to $2.45 billion. E-Daily News reported that according to MOIBA, the Korean Mobile Business Association, the exact amount paid to app market operators such as Google and Apple equaled about $1.4 billion last year. iNews reports that the Korean Webtoon Industry Association President Bum Gang-seo testified that if operators such as Google or Apple were able to demand 30% commissions, it would drive up the price of ebooks up to 40%, and that it would lead to decreases in revenue for the Korean publishing industry of $1.7 billion this year and up to $4.2 billion in 2025, quoting research from Byung-Jun Yoo, a professor at Seoul National University. Seo also quoted recent research which showed that if Google and Apple were allowed to take 30% in commission fees, that the Korean webtoon and publishing industries would lose about 18,000 jobs. One can see in all three testimonies, which were key in convincing the Korean National Assembly to pass the Korean InApp Purchase Restriction Act, is not the concept of freedom of developers to use third-party payment processing systems, but rather economic arguments that focus on the effect of commissions. Third-party payment processing systems are not the main point, despite the wording of the reporting surrounding the law suggesting it is. It's merely the means for Koreans to try and circumnavigate the commission fees that Google and Apple are currently collecting. This is also one of the key motivations for Epic in their suit against Apple. One can merely point to the fact that for all intents and purposes, Epic has achieved what they publicly set out to do, as the court found Apple's anti-steering measures anti-competitive and requires them to allow third-party payment processing systems. Yet, because the court does not find issue with Apple demanding a commission, even if payments are processed via third-party payment processing systems, Epic is appealing the decision. This begs the question, if Epic has achieved what it set out to achieve, why have they chosen to appeal the court's decision? And that's because While they're talking about third-party payment processing systems, what they're really talking about is commission fees. So while lawmakers and Epic can talk about the freedom of developers to utilize other payment processing systems as a public justification, the bottom line is, to quote the singer Meha, it's all about the money. For those of us who are more hip-hop inclined in our listening habits, to quote Wu-Tang Clan, cash rules everything around me. So while both the Korean In-App Purchase Restriction Act and the Epic vs. Apple decision agree, despite not actively naming it as such, about the root of what they're trying to regulate, the commissions that app market operators collect, they depart in what the operators are entitled to. The Korean In-App Purchase Restriction Act does not guarantee that operators are entitled to a commission, with many arguments for the law focusing on cutting out these operators entirely and not giving them any commissions as noted above. However, Judge Rogers' opinions differ. On page 66 and 67 of the Epic vs. Apple decision, Rogers writes, Epic Games ignores this other functionality, meaning the secure tracking and verification of in-app purchases, to argue that Apple merely matches developers to consumers, a matching service. This statement is partially true, but Apple has never argued that it levies the commission merely because it matches the developers with the customers. Apple argues that it uses this model to monetize its entire intellectual property against the entire suite of functions, as well as to pay for the 80% of apps which are free and generate no direct revenue from the developer other than the annual $99 developer fee. Also, creating a seamless system to manage all its e-commerce was not an insignificant feat. Further expanding it to address the scale of growth required a substantial investment, not to mention the constant upgrading of the cell phones to allow for more sophisticated apps. Under current e-commerce models, Apple would be entitled to a commission or licensing fee. Basically, while Epic and the Korean In-App Purchase Restriction Act discuss Apple's and Google's commission as a fee related to payment processing, one which is restricted to and limited in range of payment processing of in-app purchases, these app market operators and Judge Rogers disagree. They state that this commission is a monetization of the app market operator's intellectual property, which Judge Rogers argues that Apple, in this case, is entitled to based on both intellectual property rights and contractually. This is where the agreement between the Korean law and the American decision reaches a screeching halt. The Korean law was argued for and passed based on the economic effects of developers and companies collectively saving billions from not having to pay commissions. But the US decision disagrees, effectively stating that just because third-party payment processing systems must be allowed, that it doesn't mean you can deny Google, Apple, and other app market operators their slice of the pie. Further along the decision, the judge decides to explore the possibilities and hypothetical situations in which, say, a company decides not to pay app market operators in the form of commission fees off in-app purchases and went through third-party payment systems to circumnavigate the commissions. As Judge Rogers writes on page 150 of the decision, in such a hypothetical world, developers could potentially avoid the commissions while benefiting from Apple's innovations and intellectual property free of charge. The court presumes that in such circumstances that Apple may rely on imposing and utilizing a contractual right to audit developers' annual accounting to ensure compliance with its commissions, among other methods. In this case, the companies would still have to pay app market operators their commissions on a contractual and intellectual property rights basis, but would also have to include extra work, time, and money for a yearly audit, rather than just pay these operators automatically by letting them take a cut of the in-app purchases. Thus, if the app market operators were going to take their cut either way, the logical option, both economically and in a business management sense, would be to go through the first-party payment processing systems that app market operators have already created, thus saving time, money, and labor in comparison to going through a third-party payment system and having to go through an end-of-the-year audit. Furthermore, the judge continues to poke holes in the economic logic of utilizing a third-party payment processing system. On a footnote on page 100, 50 mentioned above, the judge continues, of course, any alternative to in-app purchases, including the foregoing, would seemingly impose both increased monetary and time costs to both Apple and the developer. The judge continues on page 155, noting, the court also notes that in the but-for world, where developers could use an alternative processor, Apple will still be contractually entitled to its commission on any purchase made within apps distributed on the App Store. Thus, so long as the alternative processor charges a non-zero commission or fee for its service, no economically rational developer would choose to use the alternative processor because on each transaction they would still have to pay Apple's commission and they would have to pay the alternative processor a commission for its services. Basically, if Apple and Google are entitled to demand their cut, then third-party payment processing systems offer no real benefit to developers. The extra commission to the third-party payment processing service providers, the extra time and money investments needed for app market operators to audit developers' annual accounting, not to mention the very real security risks and customer nervousness of utilizing third-party payment processing systems, means that the idea of allowing app market operators to collect their commission regardless if it takes form of a percentage when an in-app purchase is made or any other form basically kills the idea of third-party payment processing systems as a viable option for developers. So, we already talked about how third-party payment processing is merely a roundabout way to talk about commissions. So if Google and Apple are allowed to demand a cut of in-app purchases as a payment for utilizing their intellectual property, then in this specific situation, what value do third-party payment processing systems hold for developers? And the answer is very simple. None. But keep a pin in that as we're going to return to this later. So, part 3, to quote Jessie J, and no, I'm not going to sing it, it ain't about the money, and to quote myself, it's about how much. To put it bluntly, the Epic vs. Apple decision weakens the positioning of the Korean In-App Purchase Restriction Act. Before the decision, despite Korea being a small market, there was a danger that larger markets such as the US or Europe could view Korea's decision as a precedent and follow along, meaning that Apple and Google were limited in the actions they could take. However, with the US deciding that Google and Apple are still entitled to their commissions, placing this under the realm of intellectual property rights and keeping in line with the foundations of capitalistic thought, it is more likely that the EU and other countries will follow suit. This leaves the danger of Korea becoming isolated in its policy that denies Google and Apple their commissions. In that case, however drastic and unlikely it may be, Google and Apple do have the option of just bowing out of Korea and refusing to service the country. This is a highly unlikely hypothetical situation, but the issue is that it is a possibility. And for a country which has always been at the forefront of technology, internet culture, and gaming, it's a scary possibility of that. So in this situation, for the Korean In-App Purchase Restriction Act to be effective, what should be done? So the current situation is that commissions are guaranteed as a monetization of intellectual property rights that app market operators are entitled to. And number 2 is that third-party payment processing systems offer no value to developers over using proprietary systems, Apple's or Google's payment processing systems. So the question becomes, how can we alter or revise the Korean In-App Purchase Restriction Act so that it is enforceable and can also act as an example and precedent that can be analyzed, referred to, and become an international standard, while also not conflicting with the ideas of free market capitalism and the international ideas of intellectual property rights? And the answers lie in the numbers, and the numbers don't lie. One major aspect we haven't discussed yet is that of the commission rate. We have been focused on whether app market operators are entitled to their commissions in their entirety so far, but now I want us to shift focus to the commission rates, or how large of a commission app market operators are entitled to. Currently, for the gaming industry, the going rate for both Google and Apple is 30%. While Judge Rogers does agree that these app market operators are entitled to their commission, she disagrees with Apple's arguments that they are entitled to 30%. Epic argued that Apple changed their policy based on a comment by Steve Jobs in 2008 about how the 30% fee was in order to pay the operation costs of the App Store and all profits should go back to the developers. And another comment by current Apple fellow Phil Schiller in 2012 that stated that the commission fee could be dropped to 25 or even 20% once the revenue from the App Store reached $1 billion annually. Legally speaking, this argument holds very little water. Steve Jobs' off-the-cuff remarks and Phil Schiller's statement that the commission rates could be lowered were both casual remarks, neither representing the company's actual stance and thus don't form an official policy. Meaning that Epic's argument that Apple has deliberately misled developers with one policy and they changed it is stretching it, to put it lightly. That being said, while the judge disagrees that two informal comments construct a policy and thus Epic's argument in general, she does agree with a certain part of Epic's argument, stating, however, the court does agree that the comments confirm that the 30% is not tied to anything in particular and can be changed. Moreover, it shows that Apple used other provisions to hide information on those commission rates from the customer. Apple argues this 30% rate is justified based on two main arguments. A 30% rate is standard across the gaming industry, and a 30% rate is justified by the extra value developers get from utilizing the App Store. To give some context for the first argument, across gaming, not just mobile gaming, but also consoles and PC, game distribution, the going rate is 30%. Steam, PlayStation, Xbox, and Nintendo all share the 30% commission rate, and this rate was first chosen due to the fact that it was much lower than the commission rate of physical stores before the more widespread growth of online game distribution. There are certain distribution platforms, such as Epic's own Epic Game Store, that offer lower rates, but it can safely be said that the standard rate for the PC and console game distribution market is 30%, as Apple says. Now, that being said, the judge disagrees with both of Apple's arguments. For the first argument, while the going rate for the gaming industry is 30%, this is what is known as a headline rate, or the default value that is listed on documentation. That being said, just because a headline rate is default value does not mean that it is fixed in value. As evidence was shown in court, the Amazon App Store has a headline rate of 30% like Apple and Google, but its effective commission is only 18.1%. And also there was classified evidence that consoles will often negotiate for a lower rate for larger developers. The judge further dismisses Apple's first argument on the basis that while console and PC gaming and mobile gaming both fall under the umbrellas of gaming, they have very different characteristics, noting just because it is the competitive rate for games in the console market doesn't mean that the rate translates to the mobile game market. The App Store has very different operating margins than consoles, so even if the commission is the same, the economics and the nature of the products are very different. One merely has to think about the amount of research and development costs a console-based company has to invest to create a next-generation console, alongside the needs of developers to have to create physical copies of games, a business model which is usually constructed of a single large upfront purchase, in comparison to the more generalized nature of mobile games, the unimportance of physical markets in mobile games, and the fact that mobile gaming is much more based on a model of free distribution that is monetized through a longer process of continual microtransactions. To understand the judge's argument that console and PC gaming markets differ in their economics than those of the mobile gaming market. As for the argument of added value, Judge Roger disagrees with that argument also, stating this claim is unjustified absent competition. However, it is impossible to say that Apple's 30% commission reflects the fair market value of its services. Secondly, Apple has provided no evidence that the rate it charges bears any quantifiable relation to the service provided. Basically, the judge is stating that Apple has no evidence to state that its services actually provide 30% of value and that there's no competition, which means there's no point of reference, which means it's impossible to calculate the value of Apple's services, which means that Apple's argument is pretextual. So if commissions are guaranteed due to their intellectual property rights, but the commission rates are questionable, this offers a new perspective from which we can view the Korean InApp Purchase Restriction Act. Right now, by mandating third-party payment processing systems to be allowed, Korean lawmakers believe they have tackled the issues of commissions. It is of my opinion, and what I will be arguing in these next few parts of this session, that Korean lawmakers should shift their focus to regulating commission rates rather than commissions in and of themselves. So let's look at the three key aspects of the Epic versus Apple ruling. Apple must open their system to the implementation of third-party payment processing systems. App market operators are entitled to a commission, even if it isn't in the form of a commission on paying purchases. And third, there's no evidence that this rate should be 30%, nor is there any evidence that the rate must stay at 30%. These are the aspects of the Epic versus Apple decision that I believe are important in how they will affect the enforcement of the Korean IAP Restriction Act, both domestically in Korea, but also as a precedent to be referenced by other countries internationally. Currently, the issue that clashes with the Korean IAP Restriction Act is that it clashes with point 2 in the slide before. As the US decision becomes a precedent that many countries look to follow, it will be important for Korean lawmakers to change the focus of the IAP Restriction Act. It will be wiser, rather than to swim upstream against the flow of international recognition of international intellectual property rights, but rather aim to leverage the current law into something which can still regulate app market operators. Thus, Korean lawmakers should drop the pretense of freedom of developers and focus on trying to work with point 3 of the previous slide and regulate the rate of commissions, not the app market operator's entitlement to commissions itself. A law that targets commission rates is more enforceable than one that targets commissions itself. If international precedent is set that the commissions on app market operators are part of their monetization of their intellectual property rights, it becomes difficult for Korea, a country famous for its tech and cultural industries that rely so heavily on intellectual property rights, to go against it. However, if the law is revised in a way that recognizes these rights but can regulate the rates of these commissions, this becomes a much easier law to enforce, one that is both in order with international recognition of intellectual property rights, but also one which is in the current zeitgeist of an international awareness of the far-reaching influences of big tech firms and goals of imposing regulations upon them. Furthermore, such a revision to the Korean IAP Restriction Act brings dialogue between Korean lawmakers' attempts to regulate app market operators and the US's court's opinions on the right of app market operators into harmony. This international perspective allows for a more global dialogue about the direction of the world wishes to take about these companies which have global influence and presence, and also allows the situation in Korea to become a more effective case study for the world as how to try and regulate and adjust laws to an evolving technological landscape while also keeping with the spirit of free market capitalism, which creates the foundations and environments for these innovations in technology to emerge. So let's now talk about this. So up to now, we've talked about how third-party payment processing systems are worthless, provide no value, are not a viable option for developers, and so on and so forth. In their current predicament, this is true. I promise I haven't been lying to everybody here. That being said, I still believe in the potential of third-party payment processing systems, in their potential importance and how they can help create a healthier ecosystem for not only mobile gamers, but the entire mobile ecosystem in general. So while up to now we've talked about how commissions and commission fees and how to successfully regulate these app market operators, as well as the Korean InApp Purchase Restriction Act and the Epic versus Apple decision both agree that third-party payment processing systems must be made available, I think it's worth the time to discuss third-party payment processing systems, their potential impact, and how to make them a viable option for developers and a key to creating a healthier mobile ecosystem. So the current issues is that mobile app markets in the current state is that it's highly non-competitive. Apple users use the App Store and there are no alternatives. And while Google does allow the installation of third-party app markets on its platform Android, the Google Play Store still dominates the Android markets. Because these markets are both non-competitive and also highly lucrative, they have become spaces in which operators have tried to further stifle competition via anti-steering methods. Though this non-competitive market made less competitive by anti-consumer, anti-steering methods, the app market operators have had no market motivation in order to further improve upon their product, whether it be providing more competitive prices, better features, or increased quality of life changes. There's been no driving force to motivate such change, allowing the app market operator to settle into a comfortable status quo. I argue that the opening of third-party payment processing systems creates cracks in this comfortable status quo and can create competition and competitors, thus driving the app market operators to increase the quality of the product and create a healthier economic system. It is only through the introduction of set competition that the market forces of competition driving innovation and improvement begin to operate upon the market of app markets. It is through this competition, I believe, that a healthier, better future for the app markets will emerge, one with healthy competition drives innovation and puts pressure on these app market operators to create more developer and consumer-friendly choices. So we discussed earlier how Apple argues that their monetization is against their entire suite of functions, but developers using third-party payment processing systems are not utilizing the entire suite of functions of Apple's or Google's systems, especially the security and payment processing features of Apple and Google. And in that case, this also this 30% commission includes a 1 to 2% commission to third-party payment processing systems that Apple itself uses due to the large amount of payments that they must process. As it currently stands, the implementation of third-party payment processing systems will be a failure. There is little business or economic justification for utilizing these systems unless we're talking about large tech firms that own their own payment processing systems that can be implemented into their own suite of apps. However, continuing from the previous assertion that the Korean in-app purchase restriction law acting as a global precedent should look to regulate commission rates rather than commissions themselves, one could also argue that in order to help with the implementation of third-party payment processing systems that create competition and allow market forces to operate within these platforms, one could regulate commission rates on purchases made through third-party payment processing systems to be lower than those made through Apple or Google's own proprietary systems. Such a solution would also help Korean lawmakers reach the primary goal of lowering the cost of commissions and reaping the economic effects of this use. Some of the leaders for advocating for the Korean IAP Restriction Act were Korean big tech firms like Naver and Kakao. These companies have their own proprietary payment processing systems. So if they were also allowed to pay a lower commission rate when they process payments through their proprietary systems rather than Google's or Apple's, this would also help the Korean lawmakers create and reap the benefits of the economic effects that they wanted. Secondly, it would create a healthier ecosystem. As Adam Smith once wrote, in general, if any branch of trade or any division of labor be advantage to the public, the freer and more general the competition, it will always be the more so. For market forces and a healthy economic system to be created within the app market, we need more competition, and this can be done through specific laws that help third-party payment processing systems be implemented. And thank you very much for your time and attention. I've been DK Lee. Thank you very much.
So do you think games will be able to use the third-party payment system instead of Google, Apple in both Korea and the US?
Yes, I do believe that eventually third-party payment processing systems will become universal in both Korea and the US, as both the Korean IAP Restriction Act and the Epic vs. Apple decision both allow and require that these app market operators open up their systems to third-party payment processing systems. So I think they will become an option. I think what's more important right now is how do we make the third-party payment processing systems a viable option for developers rather than one which exists but is not viable.
If I want to release my game to Korea's market, it is expected to have additional fee, like commission fee or others. How do you think about it?
So currently, the Korean In-App Purchase Restriction Act, or the amendment to the Telecommunications Business Act, has not been fully fleshed out. There is a lot of vagueness in the laws right now, which is open for interpretation by both courts and further lawmaking. And so right now, what you can expect is not out of the norm when it comes to fees or extra fees, but that will have to be more fleshed out as law currently right now does not really go into the specifics and details.
Okay, how about this one? How's going to happen if the effect of increasing commission fee toward the game development?
If you increase commission fees, the issue becomes this cuts into a game company's revenue, so it prevents them from being able to hire more people, spend more time, invest more into research and development. And so you get lower quality games, you get more crunch, you get an unhealthier developmental cycle. So by restricting and regulating the commission fees to be lower, I think that this can create an economic effect which is beneficial to developers.